All righty. Morning. Welcome. Glad y'all could be here. We're starting our study in Ecclesiastes. Is that too loud by chance? Or does it sound all right? It's all right. Cool. Yeah, I'm really excited to get going here in Ecclesiastes. So as we usually do, we'll start off with some prayer. So if a couple of you want to pray, and then I'll close this and we'll get rolling.
Focus on the willy-nilly Hobby Lobby versus give us good insight into all of your work, including this, which as Stu has said, it's a lot better than
Yeah, I agree with that. I love the non-Hobby Lobby version of the Bible. Yeah, thanks for this book. It's an unusual book, but we're really glad you gave it to us, God. Help us learn something about you today. Amen. All right, Hobby Lobby version. That's hilarious, Michael. It's gonna take me a second to move past that. You mean just like the nice, like the very pleasant Bible verses? Yeah. Yeah, right. Oh yeah, no, there's nothing wrong with those verses. As we've talked about though, Ecclesiastes is a very different flavor. You don't see a lot of Ecclesiastes verses in Hobby Lobby on signs that you put up around your rooms and stuff. But maybe after this series we will, because we'll really appreciate the book in a different way. That's been my experience so far. Jason and I started reading Ecclesiastes months and months ago, and the study has been really impactful, really helpful for me personally. I think I have a deeper understanding of kind of just some aspects of God that we tend to neglect, not think about, and just some realities of our world that are uncomfortable. So Ecclesiastes is a book in the Old Testament, and it fits into the wisdom literature in the Bible. And some people categorize these differently, but when I'm talking about wisdom literature, primarily talking about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, not Job. If you heard the Kanye West song, when he thought the book of Job was a job, that's an awesome line. But Kanye, he's got that sweet rap now about Jesus. It's cool. And the general purpose of these books, this genre, the wisdom literature, we kind of answer some big questions. What does it mean to fear the Lord? How should we live in light of the fact that God's there? How do we incorporate truths about God into our lives? What is a good life? What makes for a good life, a good experience? These are the questions that the wisdom literature really deal with. And Proverbs is especially famous for these short sayings, these principles that are true in general for how life works best. And the book of Ecclesiastes stands in stark contrast to the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs, says things like, "Oh, it's better to hold your tongue and have people think you're smart than start talking and look like an idiot." They have these kinds of sayings, or like the way of the wicked basically perishes, but the righteous, like that, God's going to get behind these people and bless them. So there are these general sayings, but Ecclesiastes brings this totally different perspective, and it's like, yeah, but life doesn't always work like that. And people can have a really hard time with understanding, interpreting the wisdom literature, because you read these statements in Proverbs and you can tell, like, okay, there's wise things here in terms of how we take knowledge and apply it to our lives, really helpful instruction, but things don't always go well. Another proverb is you should like seek counsel and your plans will basically succeed. Well, I've asked advice for people and things don't always turn out well. So what about that? Ecclesiastes is kind of the counterbalance to what we find in Proverbs. Like life doesn't always go like it should. And what are we to make of that? Where's God in the midst of those experiences? Very interesting book. So I'm going to plug these two books. And sorry, the images look not as good there as they did on my laptop, but you'll have to get used to it because these will come up a little bit. But shout out to Todd. These are excellent books. I have thoroughly enjoyed them. And I don't know if it's like corrected some of my interpretation, but it's definitely given me a different flavor, a different emphasis that I think I would have missed without these books. So Living Life Backward, that's Gibson, and then Recovering Eden. I think it's S-Wine. I don't know how you say his last name, but Zach here. And I'm going to pull just some quotes as we go here, because I think these authors really capture the themes really well of the overall purpose of the book, and they state it very, very nicely. So we'll just hear it from them. So I want to give you kind of an overview of what are some of the themes that we're going to be looking at as we go through our study in Ecclesiastes. So in Ecclesiastes, God intends you to know him by requiring you to look plainly and without polish at yourself, your neighbors, and the world in which you and I live. I think, this piece about without polish, the Bible's not shying away from the difficult, tragic things we encounter in life. It feels like a very human book, very authentic. And I think in general, the book strikes a chord with people. I think I mentioned this last week or the week before, because we were camping last week. But it strikes a chord with people who are maybe naturally cynical. I think it does strike a chord there because you just kind of automatically just dial in on all the really crappy things and bad things in life. But it also really strikes a chord with people that have suffered deeply in this life and have a very firsthand experience of things should not be like this. We see these things and we're like, it shouldn't be this way. And it just rips up your insides seeing it. The Bible doesn't shy away from these types of issues. And so we could maybe summarize it by saying, the world is full of suffering and injustice. And I think here in the US, we tend to ignore it and put it out of sight. We're really good at doing this. We spend lots of time entertaining ourselves, not going through the rough parts of town, seeing poverty. Some of us, though, and I was with Scott Boos earlier. He's at his kid's football game. We saw him at the stadium because Abe had his first football game this morning. And Scott runs Be Able. I think if Scott were here, he would definitely affirm that there's a lot of suffering and terrible circumstances that people find themselves in. And I think, and I know a lot of you have been around Be Able, and we help out there. And the more we engage with the stark reality of life, I think the more we have this feeling internally that it shouldn't be like this. People shouldn't have to suffer like this. And if you felt that or you've thought that before, this book will be great for you. Today also happens to be the 21st anniversary of 9/11. And we're really good at hiding, ignoring, and I'll give you some more examples of that in a minute, suffering of other people and poverty, but unless we're totally confronted with it. And now there's tragic suffering in our face all of a sudden. But the reality is that was, obviously a terrible day for the US. Lots of suffering ensued as a result of that. Innocent people dying, and they continue to die. And this happens throughout the world regularly. I think we can, just living here and not seeing this day in, day out, not living in war zones and third world countries where just having clean water is like, are we going to have clean water today? I think it's just easy to miss this kind of thing. We also, just so you know what I mean when I say we try to put this out of sight. If you've ever studied urban planning, city planning, kind of the history of US cities, this is a really fascinating study about how we have just very practical examples of how we've implemented this and try to put the suffering and poverty of other people just out of sight, out of mind. So as the urban centers started to move, especially the wealthy people in urban centers started to move out as cars were invented and highways are being built, they move out to the suburbs and they enact rules, zoning laws. And you can go just down point by point about zoning and make direct relationships to the kinds of people that can move into these neighborhoods. So minimum lot sizes. If you put minimum lot sizes in this neighborhood, who can afford to move there? Well, people that can afford the lot, big enough house. And then there's restrictions around like multifamily dwellings. You can't have apartment building can't go up in this neighborhood because this is a nice neighborhood. We have zoning, and it keeps out a certain class of people. You have to be able to afford really, the kinds of houses that people want in their neighborhood. And so zoning is just one example of like very specific ways that I think we tend to put this out of sight and out of mind. But humans around the world throughout history have suffered, continue to suffer terribly. And Ecclesiastes doesn't shy away from that. So here's another thought from S. Wine here. Maybe I'll just call him Zach, since that's a safer bet. Ecclesiastes is a meditation on what it means to be alive in a world that God has made and called good, yet which has also gone very wrong, often in catastrophic ways. So this book is really, I'd say, the book in the Bible to go to, maybe Job as well, but definitely Ecclesiastes, to try to make sense of this reality that we find. God's created the world. He's supposed to be good. He says this creation is good. This is our experience. Proverbs says this is a good life, and if you do these things, you should have a good life. But if you do that and it doesn't work out, what about that? Ecclesiastes is right there to help us with that. And I think for a lot of us, we tend to sense the world's not as it should be, especially when we experience the death of someone near to us. Got another great quote here from Zach. Wisdom teaches us that tears, at their best, pay tribute to something lost that was once cherished, and it was wise to cherish it. We lament the loss of a genuine good. This is why we ache when we look at the empty chair at our Christmas table and remember the one who we loved, who once sat there in tandem with us, but eats with us no more. The spokesman, this is the continued thought. I just broke it up between two pages. The spokesman of Ecclesiastes likewise looks at what the created world has become. His language rises deep from an intense longing for what it was meant to be, but is not. The lament is palpable. I just think that's such a beautiful way to describe the book of Ecclesiastes. It's this lament that the world's not as it was meant to be. And so how do we operate in this kind of environment? God, are you there? How do we deal with these different realities? And so as we get into the book here, the author of Ecclesiastes is going to walk us through aspects of our lives that resemble life as it was meant to be, and is now corrupted. And so I think as we kind of dial in on that, it helps us. Part of the point of the book, I think, is to make us really long for a different life, a more significant life, a life that we maybe inherently sense the way the world should be. The problem is a lot of times we try to gain what was lost by going after the good things God has given us and making those ultimate things. And so those are some of the themes that we're going to be sorting through as we go through the series. So with that, let's get into the text. So we're just in the first 11 verses here. And like I said, if you happen to be melancholy or cynic, you're going to love it. It's great. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. All right, so we'll start just in verse 1, because that's a good place to start. The words of the preacher. The word here is just, I don't have the Hebrew word up, but it's referring to someone instructing a gathering of people. So especially think of like a teacher, a professor, and even more specifically, the kind of professor who likes to pose questions to the group to stimulate thinking and then move on, not just straight lecture style. I don't know have you had an experience like with a teacher like that? It's a thrilling, you can call this kind of Socratic method, but I think it's a thrilling way to learn. I had a professor in grad school So there were only 3 students in the class. There's 3 of us and the professor. And every week, I don't know, probably like 20 hours, 30 hours of reading was assigned. And then we just show up to class. And she had a few notes, the professor had a few notes, and she would just ask us questions for what felt like hours, because there's 3 of us. And I think I was the only student, English was the first language. And so we're just sitting there and she asks us these questions, but they're super dialed in. And it's like, okay, well, to answer that, I got to go collect these couple things I read. Okay, well, here it is. And then she'd ask another question. It's like, oh, I got to go those other things. We start building. And it was the first experience I think I had where I was sitting there like, I think I'm learning as she's asking these questions. It was really kind of out of body experience, because it was really fascinating to me. Have you had experiences like this? It's very cool. It's not an easy thing to do, I think. She was extremely good, very good teacher, because instead of just giving us the information, she's posing questions. That's exactly the flavor of Ecclesiastes. The preacher, this author, is going to lob a question, and instead of just answering it directly, if this were an interaction, he'd be waiting for us to give some responses. But since it's a written document, he'll answer it himself, but in a super roundabout way with some illustrations. And you're like, so, but what was the answer to the question? And he's just kind of giving, these seemingly maybe unrelated illustrations. But it's very cool. You kind of understand things as you move on. So that's who we have, this preacher. And right here, we get a little bit more detail. The son of David, king in Jerusalem. Okay, if you kind of look up authorship on Ecclesiastes, a lot of sources are going to say probably Solomon, but here's all these reasons why, hey, maybe it's not Solomon. Look, Solomon fits the bill like 99 out of 100 times. Solomon was David's son. He reigned in Jerusalem. So we just take there's not many of David's sons that reigned in Jerusalem. And especially as we kind of hear more details about this preacher, the author, as we go, he fits the bill. He was super wealthy, super wise. There's this great story in 1 Kings 3 where Solomon's having this dream and he's having this interaction with God, and God's like, well, what do you want me to give you? And he's like, I'd like to be given wisdom, because he's like, I don't know, I'm supposed to rule, and I don't know how. I need wisdom, God. And God really liked that answer. And he's like, oh, well, since you didn't ask for like riches and long life, I'm definitely going to give you wisdom, but I'm going to give you that stuff too. It's like, good answer. And Solomon was famously wise in the way that he ruled, famously wise in the amount of money they were raking in. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting. I didn't get all the stats on the slides, but if you go check it out, I mean, it is insane amounts of money that he would collect on a regular basis. Basically, silver became, gold was so common that silver was like worthless in Jerusalem at this time. It's like, well, I don't need your silver. Where's the gold? Because everybody had tons of gold. So he was rich beyond measure, and he had enough lady partners. It would have made most guys on campus blush. Total fornicator, crazy sexual experience. And this, remember, we mentioned this a couple times ago. Just because it's described in the Bible doesn't mean that's prescribed. God wasn't into this. This wasn't a good thing that God wanted him to do. It's just what he did, and it's recorded for us. So we need to make sure we make those distinctions, when we read historical accounts. But as we go, this description, this kind of background would make 100% sense if Solomon was the guy that wrote this. Everything lines up. And so he lived in like 900s BC. So this is ancient stuff. And so, of course, the dating tends to really follow who people land on for the author, but it's Solomon. I mean, we won't spend any more time on it. Solomon wrote it. So then, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. All right, your translation might say meaningless. It's meaningless. It's all meaningless. And one thing to know, whether it says vanity or meaningless, it's repeated. And so in Hebrew, they would just repeat the words to emphasize them. So And so even when Jesus speaks, he says, truly, truly, this is vanity of vanity. And the word here is habel or vel. And it's not just habel, it's habel. It's like really, really habel. And it's usually translated vanity or meaningless. Kind of two definitions here. The first would be kind of fleeting. Think of like your breath. Was anybody out really early this morning? Did you see your breath? I don't know if we were there, but it was quite cool. I was hoping we could, because it would have been perfect for today. But just imagine a really cold morning and you walk out and you're like, oh, it's cold, and there goes your breath, and it's gone just like that. Or yeah, if you see smoke, if we're around the campfire last weekend, it's like smoke's there and then it's gone. It's just of a person's breath, a breeze, a vapor. Or it could also be futile. There's no purpose to it. It's pointless. And in some senses, yeah, I guess the vapor, it's there and gone. I mean, they're clearly related, but there's definitely different aspects of this definition that I think are worth camping out. And actually, I think, and this is maybe part of my new understanding of this book overall, but the emphasis really seems to be on this fleeting nature, that it's there and gone. And that makes a lot more sense of the book to me, if this is primarily the meaning that is trying to be captured. So it's just merely a breath. And part of the reason I think that, as we go in the book, the preacher is going to say it's better to do this thing than this thing. And it's like, well, if everything is totally pointless, why would it be better to do one thing versus the other thing? So he says, like, it's better to have one handful of quiet than two handfuls of toil. Or like, we can get behind that. Quiet sounds nice. But if it's all totally pointless, why would one be better than the other? So, and then there's a few other reasons, but I think the idea of vapor, like the brevity of just, it's gone in an instant, try to keep that in mind as we read. And I have a little bit more to say about that in a bit. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? This word is generally translated profit, like what's left over. So if you look at financial statements a lot, Randy likes financial statements. I like financial statements. Anybody else financial statements? Me and Randy, I guess. That's okay. So what's left, profit is what's left. You have your income come in, you pay your expenses, and profit is where it's at. What do we have left over? We want to be in the black. And that's really the flavor of this verse. What profit, like what's left over for all the work that you do under the sun? What advantage, what profit does man have? What remains? What's accomplished? Kind of the sense here. And then we have this very important phrase, under the sun. And this is a very interesting phrase, only appears in Ecclesiastes. It's unique to the book, and it's repeated throughout the book constantly. And so when we approach this phrase, there's kind of two ways this is often interpreted. One aspect, like one perspective, is that the preacher is exploring what life is like under the sun, meaning a worldview without God. And I've heard this a lot. This is by far the most common one I've heard, that in Ecclesiastes, it's an experiment on worldviews. And it's like we're considering what life is like from the perspective of someone who does not know God. And there's a lot of reason people think that. Part of the reason is because the flavor of Ecclesiastes is kind of such an affront to our general impression of what Scripture should be like and what the nice things that God usually says. And I think that's part of where this comes from. But some would say under the sun is really a worldview without God. Other people say it's what the preacher doing is emphasizing the fleeting nature of life under the sun. And under the sun means more of a marker of time. Usually the sun is used to mark time. That's true. I mean, we use our calendars, we're on a solar calendar. And in the Bible, it's often used to mark passage of time. And I think we don't really have a lot here. I'm not giving you a lot to evaluate the two views kind of on face value. But I think we clarified by just reading a little bit more in the text. So we're going to keep reading. But those are kind of the question, the maybe two flavors that are out there. Okay, so we read 3, a generation goes, generation comes, but the earth remains forever. So just note here, we have a question posed. What advantage does man have or profit in all his work in which he does under the sun? And notice there's not a direct answer in verse 4. I'd love for there to be an answer. Yeah, what do we gain, preacher? And then we just go into this long discussion. A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also, the sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Blowing toward the south, then turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses, the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. Okay, so just to clarify that, just as the sea is never satisfied, humans are never satisfied with seeing and hearing. I mean, at what point in your life do you I've seen and heard enough? There's always new experiences, and there's no way to catalog just the endless stimulation in the world and the endless repetition of the world, the coming and going, the passage of time. That's kind of the flavor there. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one might say, see this? It is new. Already it has existed for ages, which were before us. Okay, so my skeptics in the audience are like, hold on, nothing new? What about technology? Smartphones, things like that. And I think it's a really good question. The point the preacher, I think, is making here is that fundamentally, there's nothing new about life, about the human experience. You just kind of back up thinking, what's the purpose of, let's just say the phone, not so much the smartphone, because the smartphone has maybe more purposes, but let's just start with communication. So humans, from the beginning of time, have had this innate desire, this innate pursuit of relationship. And we've used different ways of staying in touch, but the fundamental thing going on here is we stay in touch with people, we cultivate relationships. We've also had a natural curiosity and capacity for exploring the natural world. And there's nothing new about that. There might be new lands, but what's really driving that, the human experience, we want to see new places and then conquer those new places. It doesn't have to be like imperial conquer, but just to domesticate, make it possible to live in. It's just innate driver of the human experience. So Elon Musk might take us to Mars, but it's still very similar. Humans have been doing this forever, finding new areas, exploring new areas. And so I think what he's saying is there's nothing to break this repetitive, cyclical nature of life as we experience it. It's the same thing, it's repeated. So when he says nothing new, I think like that. Okay, so this has existed for ages. And then verse 11, there's no remembrance of earlier things and also of later things which will occur. There will be no remembrance among those who will come later still. Oh, and I didn't mention some of the capitalization. This is, it's kind of poetic. And so these are actually kind of, depending on your translation, they might capitalize and have new lines there. But hopefully we're seeing kind of the flavor. And I think if you have a chance, just read Ecclesiastes in big chunks at a time. You really get the sense of, even the rhythm of the writing kind of reinforces some of the points that the preacher's making. It's really interesting. But what is he saying? The sun rises, the sun sets, the generations come, they go. The wind, it comes, it goes. The eyes, the ocean's never full. The eye and the ear were never full. And what do we have to show for all of this toil? Remember, that was the question we started with. And the preacher's answer was this 4 through 11 verses of just, I don't know, these musings. So what do we make of that? So the implied answer here is, well, nothing is gained because there's nothing left over. It's all the same stuff. It's all the same experience that humans have been experiencing. And so I think where I land on this, the question, was man gain or profit under the sun? And what do we mean when we say under the sun? I really love how Gibson summarizes that perspective here. He says, it's a way of saying that for as long as the earth lasts in this period of time, so think more of like a temporal marker, it's marker of time, this is how things are. This side of eternity, life is a breath. We do the same things over and over again in a world repeating itself over and over again, and then we die, only to be followed by our children who will do the same things in the same way and then meet the same end. So that's the perspective. So the preacher's asking, what do we gain? What is there left? Well, under the sun, this side of eternity, and in the human experience, this is where we land. There's nothing is really gained under this side of the sun. So back to kind of that interpretive debate, I really land over here, that it seems like the preacher is really emphasizing the fleeting nature of life under the sun. And I think that does a better job of kind of making sense of the book. But I will say, evaluating life under the worldview without God is a very helpful exercise, and it's a totally valid application of the text. It's just, we want to keep in mind, we want to separate interpretation from application. We start with interpretation. And I think this is the best interpretation. And the only other piece of evidence I'll give you for that is the preacher mentions God in basically every chapter. I stopped counting. I got a few quotes and I was like, okay, the point's there. So verse in chapter 1, it's a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. Chapter 2, this also I have seen that this is from the hand of God. And it goes right on down the list. The preacher is still, he's trying to make sense of reality, but he's still considering how God fits into all of this. It's not as if he is putting on some lens and saying, okay, God's not there. What is life under the sun like? God comes up repeatedly throughout the letter, throughout the book, and of course in the conclusion, very much about God. But nearly every chapter, the preacher is talking about vanity and giving us more, unpacking that idea a lot more. But he's mentioning God, and so I think it's a better bet to interpret this under the sun perspective as it's a marker of time, this side of eternity, rather than a worldview apart from God. So that's kind of where I land there. So how do we summarize what we've read? Those are our verses. Life is a breath. You're here and then you die. That's part of the point of the first 11 verses. And we should just take it face value, just like that. We don't need to qualify it. And the world continues without regard to how you lived your life, your toil. And so the question is, what have you gained under the sun? What is of lasting significance of your toil under the sun? Maybe another way to phrase that. The implied answer is there's nothing gained. That's part of the preacher's point. There's nothing gained under the sun. And we could just end there. And I think that would be totally fair, but we'll keep going. Where are we headed? The preacher is going to teach us how to live by considering the true nature of life under the sun. So being confronted with this fact that your death is certain, life is brief, and the world's really messy, how should we live? That's really the question the preacher is addressing. But there's 12 chapters you really have to wade through and kind of ride that roller coaster as he gives lots of examples. So we need to fully confront the reality, just like was it Zach earlier that said unpolished version of life, just life as it is, and really exposed to the full reality of life. So it's not just that there's no gain after we've chased the wind. It's no, the preacher's really saying there's no need for the chasing in the first part, because under the sun there is nothing to be gained. We need something else. It should make us long for something else, something that has significance. And this is the spoiler alert. This is how the book ends, last 2 verses of the book. Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every good deed and every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So he's concluding how we live life in this life, knowing it's brief, knowing that we're created beings, that will be accountable to a creator, and we'll give an account for our lives. That's how he ends. And so the preacher's, just to really emphasize the point, he's wanting us to confront the reality of life as we encounter it, and especially the reality of our certain death, so that we may learn to live well. Okay, so let's think about how we apply this, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So life is a breath, and it could be over at any moment. Are you pretending otherwise? This is where we're going to go to Gibson, and I think Christians and non-Christians alike pretend that life is anything but really brief. And I'll start with maybe how Christians might do this. So this is kind of a little bit longer quote, but hang in there. So in this world, those who follow Jesus Christ never find a permanent home. We find peace with God through Christ, and there is rest for the weary and burdened. But the gospel does not lead us into a settled life of contented ease. This has always been true of God's family. And then he gives some examples about Abraham and people that were following God and the kinds of lives that they lived. So the gospel is saying we're separated from God, but you can be made right with God by receiving forgiveness through Christ. That's what he's referring to there. And those who follow Christ in this world never find a permanent home. To be a believer is to be a stranger and a misfit. We have no permanent roots in this world, no sense of real belonging here. We're traveling through. Or are we? It's bolded because this is a key question. Is that how we actually live? We would agree to that as Christians, but are we actually living that way? People who follow Jesus often lose sight of the world to come. We become resident Christians rather than nomadic Christians. We become fully integrated in this world rather than viewing ourselves as passing through. And we do this by living as if our greatest treasures are here and now. We display our sense of permanence by our lifestyle choices, the homes we live in, the money we spend, the churches we build, the investments we pursue, and the priorities we live for. And Jesus knew this would be a problem for Christians. He knew we were going to have trouble investing, making the right kinds of investments, not just the ones focused in this life. This is what he says in Matthew 6. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy. I like that. And where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So he warns us, don't store up treasure on earth because it will perish. You're not taking it with you. Death is certain. These things will not last. That's part of the point here. Okay, and then Gibson finishes out this thought here. And to stop us from doing the wrong kind of storing, so storing up the wrong treasure, and to help us begin to do the right kind of storing, God has given us the book of Ecclesiastes. In his first 11 verses, those are the ones we read, the preacher taught how the world itself shows there's no lasting gain in all our human toiling. He sought to end the games we play about the permanent significance of our lives. And so his big point here is, I think, as Christians, it's very easy to convince ourselves that we have lots of time here on earth, that there's always tomorrow to move forward with God, to do the next thing with God, next thing in front of us, to have the conversation we really need to have with somebody who doesn't know God. I think that's how Christians might be pretending otherwise, pretending that our lives are anything but very brief. And I think if you're here investigating God, uncertain about God and the Bible, unsure what you think about these things, I think this is a very productive line of questioning. What meaning is there in life, in your life specifically? Because I think this is where understanding worldviews is really helpful. In a worldview apart from God, and this is where it's a valid application, I think, to, as we study Ecclesiastes, think about it from the perspective of worldviews. But if we evaluate, if God is out of the picture and we're in a naturalist worldview, an atheistic worldview, so no God in this worldview, the physical world is really all that we see, and it's all that there is. And so we need to ask ourselves, is there anything ultimately significant about the human experience? And you can compare that to insects, animals, like what is different at that point? How can we make any distinction? These are important questions to think about. Sam Harris is a good person to read. He's one of the leading thinkers, I think, on is there meaning, because he's an atheist. Is there meaning apart from God? He argues that there is. But I think you cannot escape the fact that it tends to be subjective. And the reality is the conclusion's often, well, we just have to be okay with the subjective meaning, not an ultimate meaning, but like if I'm true to my meaning and you're true to your meaning, that's good enough. I think internally we kind of sense, is that, I don't know, that doesn't seem like it's good enough. You really have to press the philosophical foundation. And I don't think there's a great foundation for having meaning in a naturalist worldview. But you really have to poke the foundation and really ask, what is this based on? So I'd really encourage you to do that. That's a great exercise. And probably one of the best resources on that. Evidence Unseen is an excellent book by James Rochford. He asked this question and he brings in perspectives from all the leading naturalist thinkers on this topic. And the short end of it is I think the most honest naturalists agree that there's no ultimate meaning. Their conclusion's different though. It's just like, well, you can pretend that there's meaning and it's helpful for your life. But there is actually no real meaning. And so we're left with like an existential type crisis that this amoral universe gave rise to people that are now conscious of understanding that we feel like we should have meaning, but there is no meaning in our world. And so we're just out of joint with the way things are. Great read. It's like just the first, I don't know, 5 chapters of that book or something. He addresses this question: can there be ultimate meaning in a world without God? You really ought to consider that if that's where you're at this morning. Our other application point is you will die and be forgotten. And so what is that? It's like, okay, that's helpful. The reality is that's meant to motivate you to want something better. It's not just, don't just stay there, that we'll all be forgotten. And I mean, it's a great exercise just to think about. So I know my grandparents, and my dad's side, I knew both of them. My mom's side, I knew my mom's mom. I know nothing about their parents. If you put a gun to my head, I don't even think I could name their first names. It's really bad. But that's kind of the reality. Even if you know the next generation up or a couple generations up, within a handful of generations, people will know nothing about our lives. And that's sobering, I think, but it's meant for you to motivate us to say, that doesn't sit right, because I feel like life should matter more than that. And we should not just be forgotten because we're significant people. That is the Bible's view. You are significant, but you're meant for something more than just trying to toil away in this life and taking the good gifts God's given and making them ultimate things. We need to get our perspective really beyond the sun, that there is another side of eternity. There are things we can do in this life that will last and will have significance for the long run. So it's really meant to motivate us to live a life, seek a life that has significance. And that's the kind of last point. Life under the sun is not all there is, according to the Bible. The preacher's really camping out on this perspective, this side of the sun and the life we experience. But, and I think as Christians, the more we experience life under the sun, this side of eternity as it really is, where we're not sweeping all of the really bad parts of life under the rug, that we're actually confronting the suffering that people have in their lives, the injustices, the oppression that goes on. I think the more we confront that and we see that for just the way it is, the more we really long for life in eternity, for God to set this right, because this is not as it should be. And so I think as I've studied this book, I just find it deeply comforting to read it and then confront even the wisdom of, let's look without the non-polished version of the human experience and understand that God is still there. There's still something to know about God and to relate to God in the midst of that. And that's really the point of, I think, one of the main themes of Ecclesiastes is learning to live this life under the sun with the perspective that God is still there. He's not disappeared. And so what do we make of that? So looking ahead each week, we've kind of organized the series around these different areas of life that the preacher is saying is just vanity of vanities. So he gets more specific. This is just kind of the intro, but now he's going to keep drilling that theme in really specific areas of our lives. And so our approach is basically going to be, let's see what the preacher has to say about this area. And then we're also going to, just so that we understand, because the Ecclesiastes does not then present, well, here's the reflection of like the whole counsel of Scripture and how God views these things. So we're also going to bring in just what's the biblical worldview on these topics, because the point of the book is really just to get you to this place where you're confronting the reality of life this side of eternity, but we also want to provide just some more holistic development of kind of a biblical worldview. So that's kind of how we're going to go through the series. So with that, we'll see if there's any questions or comments, but that's what I've got on 1 through 11. What questions? Yeah, Jason. Huh? Yeah, no Homer. It just felt right. It would be pointless anyway. It just felt right to just list it like that, plain Jane, after Ecclesiastes. Yeah. Definitions for those? Oh, that's Hebrew. Sorry. Yeah, Hebrew. Yeah, those are Hebrew words. I didn't say it, so maybe there's nothing to miss. Yeah, those were that's Hebrew. This is Old Testament, written in Hebrew, very old, ancient language. Yeah, there's one. Yeah, like Kabel, Hebrew. Yeah. Other questions? Good question. Yes. This? Yeah. 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 You still believe in God and you're still experiencing. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I know. Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah. Yes. I think I've told Heidi like 100 times doing this study, you're gonna love this. You really need to read this book because you are maybe the person that came to mind as I think about just experiencing the hard things in life and trying to figure out what do we do with this and asking hard questions of God. Yeah. I heard something over here. Yeah. They're not, yeah. Yes. Yes. Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And I agree that I think the right column here is the better understanding of the word being used, what's trying to be communicated by the author, but it's perfectly valid. It all applies to a worldview without God, other than the parts where he is like, well, God gave us this or this thing, and here's the conclusion, fear God. It's like, so clearly he still has his theistic worldview on, but if we get here, confront reality as it is, and we think there is no God, then we're left with all those conclusions. Everything is meaningless. And I think we could bring in the full version of that word. It's not just that it's a breath, but it's actually all ultimately not significant. And of course, that's debated. But like I said, if that's a real question for you, I think Rochford has some of the best stuff. He cites the best people, the leading thinkers from the naturalistic or atheistic worldview and their conclusions. Yeah, it's really good. Randy, you had something? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what were their experiences? Yeah. Yeah. yeah, as you live life and as people that you're close to die, like I said, I think that is probably the clearest example that it just, if this is such a natural part of life, the natural world is all there is. We have these physical lives, and then we're done and gone. Other than missing somebody, like they're not here anymore, shouldn't that be just part of the normal experience if that's all there really is? Why do we have this feeling that there's something off about this picture? And then yeah, how our perspectives change. Yeah, good thoughts. Yeah, what else? Yeah, I'll go Todd and then Jason. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was the C.S. Lewis quote that we have these longings for things and they have actual ways to resolve those longings. So if we long for something more, something this life doesn't have, probably because we're meant for another world, another life. I think, yeah, said as well as only C.S. Lewis could say it. So good. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yes. Mm-hmm. We're conscious. Yeah. Yeah. So different. Yeah, good point. That yeah, the animals don't question. They're not cognizantly aware of their experience. What's the meaning of this? But humans are. Why is that? Okay, we're gonna go. There's so many. Let's go up here first, then we'll go back there, and then we'll go over here. Go ahead, Michael.
I think it ties in really well with God.
Yeah.
Like it helps me or makes sense. I think it's concept and aspect of like walking with God forever.
Mm-hmm.
When that break happens, reason it feels so weird. Yeah, it's just another example of here's God's design. Fix it, get back to God. Yeah, I think
Exactly.
I think all that ties back into creation, and that really is where we're supposed to sit. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
It's a coherent picture. Yeah, from creation on, it's a coherent picture, and that's why that one book is titled "Rediscovering Eden." I think as a commentary on Ecclesiastes. So it's a great connection. Yeah. All right, Jenna. I think he just had stuff to say. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there was a particular occasion other than reflecting on his life. I might be wrong on that, but it's very similar to Proverbs, collection of sayings that are meant to instruct people. And so, because the way it refers to him, the root word is about a gathering of people. And so, it was really meant to be an instruction to a group of people. Yeah. Yeah, ecclesia. Yep. Go ahead. Yeah.
so Proverbs like by Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
But Proverbs
Teasers.
like young Solomon, very here's everything.
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes is like the end of his life, and he's like, wait.
Hold on. Right.
It's sort of like Solomon's diary.
Yeah, his development. It's good.
Here's the end.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, yep. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. so at this point in our book, all we have is this idea of brevity of life, that life is very brief. And that should motivate us to want to spend our time doing things that are going to count more than just under the sun, this side of eternity. We haven't gotten there in the book yet, but the preacher is going to give us real things. And so part of it is, I mean, maybe the losing sight quotes from Gibson kind of paint this, like, we're not meant for this life. So an application of that is, what are the things we're giving our time to that are not going to last beyond this side of eternity? Those are the things we want to pay attention to. But just as a preview of where we're going, some of the really interesting, maybe unexpected conclusions that I'm taking away from Ecclesiastes. There are sayings in here, and it actually allows us to enjoy the good things God's given us in this current time. Like right now, we can just be thankful that we have today, that we have good food and good relationships and friendships. I think Ecclesiastes really gives us this perspective of God's given you good things, and you can appreciate that when you live life with this proper perspective that they're not ultimate things, that it's this life here on this side is very brief, but be thankful for it. And so it's just kind of a very, for me, unexpected emphasis throughout the book. But if it feels like, well, it's a little bit unsatisfying in terms of how we apply this, that's because we're only 11 verses in. So keep coming. And actually, one of the commentators in these books said something like, if after reading the first 11 verses, you're kind of depressed and realizing that this life is super brief and all these things, he's like, you're starting to get it. Like that's the beginning of the perspective that the book is trying to develop in us, that we want to understand that there are some depressing things about this. There are stark realities here. That's the whole point. We need to look them straight in the face, is kind of the perspective of the book. Good question. Yeah. There you go. Yes. Saul, Hebel, when the Cowboys play. Yeah, exactly. That it is a very tangible thing, that we don't put our ultimate hope in these things that are temporary and will not last. So that is how we begin to apply this. Yeah, that's a funny example, but a good one. All right, we should draw the line there. I'm going to stop this.